Hi, Melissa.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm fine, thanks.
Nice, nice. I would say we can dive in straight away.
Sure.
I'm really looking forward to our conversation today because I believe that the problems we are going to discuss are of great importance in these times, especially. And I'm very curious about which aspects we can shed light on and which conclusions will result from it. But before we start, first of all, thank you for taking the time to be here today.
Sure.
And yeah, let's get to know you a bit better, Melissa. You're doing migration studies. You are a professor at UNU here in Maastricht. Could you explain briefly what are migration studies and also how you ended up doing this?
Sure, yeah. So I'm a professor of migration studies at UNU Merit and Maastricht University here in Maastricht. So migration studies are really the study of the movement of people around the world. It's funny because sometimes people ask me if I study birds or, other kind of animals. No, but migration studies in this context is really the movement of people and really looking at the reasons people migrate and the effects of that migration. So, I mean, I would say very broadly, that's kind of what migration studies is. I interestingly got into the field of migration studies kind of in a strange sort of backwards way. I actually started first working on remittances or the money that migrants send back to their families or to their countries of origin, usually. And first, by working on this money and looking at the effects of this money on the countries of origin of where migrants come from, I kind of worked from that then back into migration. So starting first from these kind of monetary effects and then really looking more at migration in general and why people migrate and all the different effects around that migration, both on countries of destination, but also countries of origin. So I think that's kind of how I got started in the field. And it's, one of these fields that you can kind of relate to almost anything. It's an area that you never get bored. I always tell people, tell me what you're interested in, and I'll tell you how it's related to migration. So really, sometimes people think of it as a more, targeted area of expertise, but I think of it as an area that links to everything else in the world.
Okay, awesome. And I think that makes you an ideal guest for today. So the point of departure for our conversation is this following observation, right? The outbreak of war in Ukraine has prompted a massive and unprecedented wave of solidarity with refugees escaping the conflict. And EU member states are currently hosting them in very large numbers. And there is a great deal of agreement in politics, but also in large parts of civil society that help is the only right thing to do for now. And I think that's true. It is great, fascinating, and also moving to see for me how everyone seems to be working together now, fighting for the same cause, if you will. And yet, I think this response seems somehow unusual when you consider how many EU states had taken a much harder line on immigration policy just a few weeks earlier. Let me just put it in numbers. UNHCR estimates that until now, some 4.6 million refugees have fled Ukraine to neighboring countries. And of these 4.6 million, 2.6 million are currently in Poland alone. And there and in many other member states of the EU, these numbers are increasing by the hour. But let us look back for a moment on the so-called 2015 refugee crisis, where in that year and the following years, only between 1 and 2 million refugees entered the EU, and that the people at the time who came mainly from war-torn Middle Eastern countries had to face a fundamentally different situation. They were facing, I don't know, hatred in civil society and also rejection in politics in many instances. And for the sake of illustration, let's look at two statements from Marine Le Pen, who is currently a candidate in the runoff of the French presidential election. And the first is, she said that in 2015, I quote, our country has neither the means nor the energy nor the desire to be more generous than it can be with the world's misery, unquote. And then on March 5th, 2022, she said this: I say it without any doubt, France is honored to take part in the reception of Ukrainian refugees. And for my part, I am ready to do so. And I believe that the French are ready to, unquote. I translated this roughly. In my opinion, these statements exemplify a paradigm shift that can be observed across EU countries and also across the political spectrum. Now, in various television appearances she made during her campaign this year, she justified that position by drawing on France's obligations under the Geneva Convention of 1951. But we'll come to that in a moment. But first, I would like to know, did this whole development I just described come as a surprise to you, or is the situation this time just so fundamentally different compared to other and also earlier challenges EU countries had to face with migration?
Okay, so that's a good question. In the run up to this, and when we saw that this was a definite possibility, as in it was a definite possibility that Russia would invade, and we could see, quite a massive number of refugees fleeing Ukraine. I have to say that my hope was that we would see the situation that we have seen, because it's a different type of person is not the right way to say it. It's a different group of people, as in they are Europeans, they're white, they mainly come from Christian backgrounds. Ukrainians also have quite a lot of ties already in many neighboring countries. Familial ties, cultural ties, historical ties. So my hope was that this would make a difference in a positive way. Sometimes I said, should I, actually hope that, Europe is indeed racist, like, many have kind of accused Europe of in the past. Because then at least they'll let in the Ukrainians, So for myself, I was already torn with how I even felt about the situation. But my hope was that we would see the solidarity that we have seen. And I thought that there were a number of reasons, which I have just mentioned, why we might see that solidarity. And I also don't want to be too critical here and just say, okay, well, Europe's racist and that's why we're seeing what we see now. No, I also think I should be a little bit more careful and a little bit more thoughtful with my answer there, because I do think there are differences with regard to the links that there are there already with a lot of Eastern European countries. A lot of people already have family, relatives, friends that are in these, especially in these neighboring countries that have been particularly hostile in the past to migrants or other refugees or asylum seekers. So I do want to be careful there. And I think the other thing that's different is that I saw a lot of these countries that have a border with Ukraine, have also experienced Russian aggression in the past. And so in that way, they can really, there is really this solidarity aspect, and they really can sympathize and empathize with the situation of Ukrainians, where other situations further afield in other parts of the world, maybe they could not feel the same direct feelings of solidarity. I mean, obviously, you would always hope that one would, but there is also just reality. And I think this kind of more shared history and a shared history of the specific links with Russia or, past Russia, I think are also really important here.
Yeah, we're going to look at those kinship-based arguments later on. But what I'm very interested in also is kind of understanding the legal situation of Ukrainian refugees. And I would like to illustrate this again with a statement, this time made by Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban when he visited a reception center for Ukrainian refugees in early March. And he said, "We know the difference between a migrant and a refugee. Migrants are stopped, refugees get help." Now, knowing Mr. Orban's usual anti-migration rhetoric, I tend to assume that he implies that refugees who escape war, say in the Middle East, aren't real refugees. And the decisive document on this is, of course, the Geneva Convention, which Marine Le Pen has also been drawing on a lot lately. Now, I'm asking myself, is this just a cynical political move, or is there actually a legal basis in international law for distinguishing between a refugee from one country, such as, I don't know, Syria or Afghanistan, and one from Ukraine?
So absolutely not. The Geneva Convention is very clear. And the basis for receiving refugee status or for being considered a refugee is really that you should be persecuted because of your race, religion, a number of factors. And none of those have to do with which exact country you come from, and that it's really about the conditions that you face on the ground, and if there's a well-founded fear. And we have seen that in the Syrian case, we've seen that in the Afghan case, we've seen it in the Iraq case, we see it now in the Ukrainian case. So there is no legal basis to completely differentiate people just based on the country that they come from when the underlying circumstances are the same. So no, I mean, obviously this statement is completely false. And I think Orban in many cases likes to make his own definitions for things and his own way of seeing things.
Okay, so generalizing this, do you think that then this selective treatment of refugees could be called an indirect violation of international law?
Well, this is where it gets a little bit tricky, because it also depends on what is actually happening. I mean, I do personally think that, many countries have been in direct violation of international law. So, I mean, clearly, like the formal definition of who a refugee is, or who should be able to be given refugee access, is someone who is unable or unwilling to return to their country of origin owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. All right. And there are also a number of, let's say, key principles within the having refugee status. So one of them is non-refoulement. And what that actually means is that refugees, or really anyone, should not be returned to a country where they face serious threats to their life or their freedom. And we know plenty of countries within Europe, especially, more on the eastern side, have done these kinds of things. Also issues of pushback. So someone comes into your territory, they don't even have the opportunity to put an asylum claim and are pushed back into another country or into international waters, or, what else. We know that these things happen too, and they are also direct violations of international law. And then there's also supposed to be non-discrimination. So that's another core principle of refugee status. And that means that refugees should receive equal treatment as other immigrants and citizens, and should not be discriminated based on gender, age, disability, sexuality, and others. And we see also that in plenty of countries around the world, there is discrimination, and they are not treated the same as other immigrant groups in the country, or definitely not as citizens in many cases. So, I mean, there are a number of ways here that many of these governments have gone directly against many of these core principles previously, and have now made a 180-degree turn when it comes to the case of the Ukrainians.
Okay, so that's the political and legal aspect of the whole thing. But I'd also like to look at some more emotional considerations. And in doing so, we will get a little closer to civil society. This phenomenon that suddenly there is a room for solidarity, empathy, and a quest for adherence to international law, what we saw in the very extreme cases of Le Pen and Orban, is, I think, not only confined to these right-wing politicians, to whom all this might even serve as an underpinning of their usual anti-migration stance, but it appears to me as if this reflects a pattern which extends in somewhat different way, and also in a somewhat weakened way, maybe in more general terms, to civil society. Think, for example, of the Ukrainian flags that people put on their windows, or the huge willingness to help or even accommodate refugees from Ukraine at home. And it's simply put, I think all these are symbols and actions which are a novelty in the way European countries or host societies deal with refugees. And what you already mentioned before is that this emotional engagement and empathy it has often been explained by the fact that refugees from Ukraine tend to be seen as white and Christian and are perceived to be culturally closer to some Europeans. To what extent do you think does our willingness to show solidarity and empathy with refugee communities depend on perceived cultural kinship, or did European societies in fact become better host societies over the past years?
Oh, that's also a good question. So in general, when I give my answers, I'm talking about like the average, right? Of course, there are plenty of people, I should also say, that did show solidarity with Syrians. You know, we did have plenty of those images and pictures of, you know, people at German train stations also holding up signs, being very welcoming to Syrians, at least in the early days. So I don't want to also paint this picture like nobody in Europe is welcoming. That's not true. But let's say the average sentiment, no, I think I really do think that solidarity and empathy with refugee communities does depend on perceived cultural kinship. I personally do not think that European societies became better host societies over the past years, let's say on average. However, I do think that we've had experiences that we could learn from, that we, you know, we know what kind of reception has happened in the past. There were also some, let's say, structures put in place that could be used also in this case. But I think it really the kind of solidarity and empathy part, I really think that becomes much, much more now because of this cultural kinship, the closeness felt. But not only, I do also have to think it has to do a little bit with and not just a little bit, with the geopolitical situation. I think Russia being seen also as a clear aggressor, you know, Russia is very close to Europe. In some cases, it's part of Europe. So I think this has made it very, very close to home for a lot of people, where it might be more difficult for people to think about situations in Syria or in Afghanistan that feel just so, not just culturally far, but also, you know, far from a distance perspective. So I do think that there are multiple things coming to play here: the cultural aspect, the kinship aspect, but also who is seen as the major perpetrator here in this regard. Also, I think does matter for these feelings of solidarity.
Yeah, and by the way, this is by no means to say that the solidarity and empathy many show right now are not genuine or important.
Of course, yeah.
But yeah, I think it should be there in any such situation. And for me, it is very difficult not to think of Afghanistan 1 year ago and the response EU countries have put on back then, which was a failure and also a manifestation of ignorance, I would say. And I can imagine that for many refugees from elsewhere who had to undergo, I don't know, lengthy asylum processes and certainly were treated less favorably, this must be devastating. But now I think the question is, should we put more attention to this right now, or can we have that discussion once everything will be over? Because I mean, after all, the resources are limited, which makes all this a very difficult balancing act. It would also not be an option to say, as long as we cannot treat everyone equally well, it would be better to do nothing.
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of points here. You know, there are some things that have surprised me so much about people's, you know, willingness to help and you know, who is seen as worthy and all of these things. I was in the hairdressers, you know, shortly after everything started, and I overheard someone say, you know, I met a Ukrainian refugee here in the Netherlands, you know, where we're based. And she told me that this time a week ago, she was in her Pilates class. and she was like, and then the person at the hairdresser said, oh my gosh, that's just like me, so it was somehow that people could really relate to this kind of very, I don't know, developed and very specific Western lifestyle, right? Whereas often when I would talk to people about Afghanistan, for example, they would say things to me like, well, these people are used to hardships, so this is just another day for them, which is just mind blowing to me. So because one group of people seemed to already be more privileged, and then their rights were taken away, we should somehow feel worse about this than a group of people who have already been in, let's say, a comparatively worse situation already that got even worse. And somehow, people in Europe are like, well, that's kind of par for the course in those countries, which just is flabbergasting to me. You already know it's bad, it gets worse, and somehow, you're going to turn the other way and say, well, we can't help everyone, which, as you just mentioned, is, I mean, just because you maybe cannot help everyone in the world does not mean you shouldn't help those that you can. I think that's really, really important. You're right also that, of course, there are limited resources, but let's also be clear, Europe, North America, let's say the developed Western world has a lot of resources that they can put towards things that they want to put towards. I have always said, also with previous refugee situations, when countries said things like, "Oh, we don't have the capacity," whatever. I always said, "Where there's a will, there's a way," and I think we're going to come back to this maybe also in a bit, but. And I think that's really important. And I don't think that it's a problem now if we at least point out the hypocrisy to a large extent of the situation we are in. That does not mean that we should not continue to show solidarity and make things work and put the effort and the resources where they should be. But I think we can also call a spade already now. And definitely as things settle down, I think you're going to see a lot more analysis, which there's already plenty that has come out, on how these situations have been treated very, very differently. You already mentioned, obviously, like Marie Le Pen and Orban taking a different stance, but there are some, there was really a really interesting piece that was put out by IP News, and it was an opinion piece by Rachel Riley and Michael Flynn, in which it's titled "A Tale of Two Refugee Crises," really, showing the clear differences between these situations, and even, taking quotes also from let me just see here, taking quotes from the Bulgarian Prime Minister, for example, Petkov, who recently said about people from the Ukraine, "These are not the refugees we are used to. These people are Europeans. These people are intelligent. They are educated people. This is not the refugee wave we've been used to. People who we are not sure about their identity, people with unclear pasts, and who could have even been terrorists." So, I mean, this quote is outrageous, right? I mean, by the Bulgarian Prime Minister, basically saying they're Europeans, so they're different. Somehow that they are more intelligent and educated, and somehow that makes them more worthy of being a refugee. Before, when I gave the refugee definition, it has nothing about being intelligent or educated, right? Yeah. And then, even talking about not being sure of identities and all of these things. I mean, it's just, yeah. I find this just, quite incredible. And you have, as you said, the same thing from Orban, who said things like, Ukrainians will be welcomed by friends from Hungary, and that someone doesn't have to be a quote unquote rocket scientist to see the difference between masses arriving from Muslim regions in hopes of a better life in Europe and helping Ukrainian refugees that have come to Hungary because of war. I mean, it's just, these are things that we all kind of knew were underlying a lot of the previous actions, but that they are so easily spoken out loud, I find really incredible.
Yeah. No, you're right. I mean, the scale of the problem is just incredible, right? I mean, yeah. So definitely, yeah, we are only at the beginning, but we should keep reflecting upon ourselves and our behavior as European societies. But before we move on to analyze some of the implications of the way European countries are dealing with the current crisis in terms of migration policy, I would like to raise an issue that seems to be going a bit under the radar. I don't know if you agree. It's about the effects that the war in Ukraine could have on the rest of the world, and in particular, what impact those in turn could have on migration to Europe. Because I have the impression that in media and also in public debate, the Ukraine crisis is always treated as something isolated, yet many analysts and in fact also UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres have warned that the war in Ukraine will have very far-reaching consequences on the rest of the world. And in the context of the launch of a new UN report on the systematic consequences of that war, he said, Antonio Guterres said, we're now facing a perfect storm that threatens to devastate the economies of the developing countries. And this, of course, is highly relevant, I think, in light of what we have discussed up to this point, because obviously the deterioration of the economic situation in developing countries will most likely lead to more migration to Europe and could then also put the current open refugee policy of many EU countries to the test. Do you think that's a realistic outlook?
So I'm going to keep saying that that's a good question. So look, we know that there are going to be far-reaching consequences of the situation in Ukraine right now. We already see, a huge change in fuel prices and oil prices and food prices. And this is going to be probably quite devastating for quite a bit of the developing world. The question here is more on how development and migration are linked, and it's not always so straightforward. When people have a severe lack of development, they often also lack the resources and capabilities to actually migrate. So on one hand, while there might be more of a necessity to migrate, there might be less of an ability to actually migrate. So I do think that we have to be a little bit careful there. There are lots of things that are compounded here too, right? So it's not just oil prices and food prices. We still have the impacts of, climate change and environmental disasters and risks and all kinds of things. So I think there's still a question mark about exactly how all of that is going to come together. Are we going to see more internal migration? Will we see more international migration? Is this going to also maybe lead to more conflicts? Also. So one thing is, what we would consider maybe more voluntary migration. Of course, the voluntariness of migration, we should really see on a spectrum and not just as, yes, it's voluntary, or no, it's not voluntary. But could a lot of this deprivation lead to more conflicts, and then more conflicts compounded also by other things also often lead to more displacement, whether or not that's internal or international. So I think we definitely need to keep a good eye on what's happening. But I think it's a little bit hard to say right now from a mobility perspective exactly what that effect is going to be, because it's not only about what people want to do, but what they're also capable of doing.
Yeah. Is it true that in a conflict that the more wealthy are always the first ones to get out?
Absolutely. Yeah. So the more wealthy, those with the most resources, those with the highest socioeconomic status, those that have maybe dual nationalities, or those that already have networks abroad are the first movers. Absolutely. And oftentimes they're not even ones that necessarily claim refugee status in another country. When they see these things coming, maybe they even have a second home in another country and they just decide to relocate. Maybe they also work for companies that they can work in different parts of the world and they relocate. Maybe they also decide to go study abroad somewhere. That as an option. So what's interesting is that often the first movers are not even people who necessarily ask for asylum or ask for refugee status, but they get out of the country. So I definitely think that's a point that should be kept in mind.
Let's take a look once more at the, or maybe not once more, but we've already talked about this a little bit, at the material and physical constraints to hosting refugees and how they look, or if they are even there. Because we are seeing right now that European countries have the capacity to host refugees in the millions if they want to. And I can imagine that from now on in political debates about refugees, the argument that there are physical and material constraints so that there's no money, there's no space, and whatever else, essentially what Ms. Le Pen said in 2015, they will be easily dismissed. And what I'm kind of getting at here is what factors influence a country's capacity to host refugees, and also what role does the mood in civil society play in this?
Yeah, so I mean, what feeds into the capacity is really, I would say, obviously the level of development of the country, the infrastructure that's there, the resources that are available. And let's just be clear and honest that in most Western developed countries, the capacity is there. The big question is always about the willingness. And what I think was quite interesting about something that you said with regard to a quote with Marie Le Pen, in the previous times, really looking at the asylum seeking in the 2015 period, she said, our country has neither the means nor the energy nor the desire to be more generous than it can be with the world's misery. So what I would agree with is that they didn't have the desire. They absolutely had the means, but they did not have the desire. There was not that willingness to really to make these things happen. And whenever there is a political will, there is a way. There have also been other times in history, if you think about also during the Balkan Wars and the large waves also of people from former Yugoslavia that also came into the EU. There were quite a lot of concessions made at that time also to help people come into Europe. But what I find baffling is that this is the first time that the EU directive to be able to just give direct, basically humanitarian protection was triggered. And it has been suggested that it should have been triggered already during 2014, 2015 situation, and maybe even in earlier times, but there was really not that political will to do so. Now the directive was triggered. We're seeing a lot of very, I should say, quite well managed migration and the possibility for humanitarian protection and people also moving on. Coordination is working quite well between member states. I'm not saying everything is easy. This is a lot of people in about a 2-month time span. All right, that's a lot. But that is so much more, as you've rightly pointed out, than we saw in the 2014, 15, 16, 17 period. And we've managed it, right? We have managed this in a pretty decent way. I'm not saying that, there were never any mistakes made or other issues there, or also definitely vulnerability issues that maybe we could have done a better job with. But I think the important point here really is political will and that society and governments are willing to do these things. And when they are, we can always find a way.
All right, yeah, but do you think that that society maybe at this point is ahead of the legislator, maybe in some sense?
Yeah, maybe a bit, because I think society's sentiment is very clearly on one side. I mean, I do think, well, the legislator, the triggering of this directive was great. I think, why not do more? Why not? Why is it on a 1-year temporary basis right now? We already know so much of Ukraine is destroyed. Why isn't this just a blanket 5-year residency? I think one thing that's not properly understood is that many people who are leaving now, they would love to return, but they're also realistic about the future. Even once places are, let's say, quote unquote, possible to return to, as in there's no more conflict, there's often not much to return to, right? I mean, things have been bombed, schools, hospitals, places of work. It's going to take a long time for people to really be able to return in a meaningful way. And in the meantime, they have children that they're growing up. They need to, there needs to be education. They're also looking to make sure that they can support their families. So in the short to medium term, people are really looking for, okay, where can we resettle and set up our lives for the foreseeable future? And I think that's just a reality that Europe should get on board with, and not just have a directive that gives people a blanket year of residence and access, but something for a bit longer too, because we know something that causes a lot of stress on people who are already very stressed, right? Because of the what they've seen, what they've had to experience, the trauma that they've already had. Often uncertainty about the future adds additional layers of trauma. And I think it's great that in this case that people don't have so much uncertainty about the next year. Well, that's still to be debated. Let's say not as much uncertainty as other refugee or asylum seeking groups, but they still have plenty of uncertainty about what happens after that year. So I think there's, of course, much more that could be done in this regard.
Yes, I think that ties in well with another point about the fact that basically normal people are doing a lot right now for refugees, and it kind of goes with this question if the legislators maybe lacking behind a bit, and that is the kind of I was asking myself, is it possible that the societal commitment replaces possibly lacking state-controlled or governmental structures? And I was asking myself that because I can imagine that in many countries of the EU, the structures that would be necessary to ensure the integration and initial reception of so many refugees are not in place. For example, there are many reports from Germany saying that the interplay between regional and federal level structures does not work very well, and even that resources are being shifted away from other refugees to Ukrainian refugees.
So I think that there's always a role for civil society. And I think that civil society in many countries often does a good job of filling in the holes or the gaps that, let's say, governments leave behind. I want to be careful about saying who should be doing what, but I think it's great to see an active civil society that can definitely help. And it's usually, what we see with civil society is also that they're often more limber. They're often, they are better placed to be able to react very quickly and in a very agile way, which governments, and I'm sorry to say the German government is often not known for being super agile. Right.
Yes.
So there, and not just the German government, of course, I'm being a little bit cheeky here, but no, governments in general are known for being slow entities, whereas civil society, small, nimble organizations can often work very quickly. This is also not to say that government should just give up their responsibilities and hand them all over to civil society. I think there's definitely a place there to work together. Coordination is also very important, I should say. But coordination should not come at the cost of just getting things done also.
Yeah, and I think also that one problem that there might be is the question of sustainability of this effort, right? Because I was once myself a volunteer in a refugee camp in northern France near Dunkirk, and one thing I realized was that what a great deal of endurance and commitment it takes to make at least a small impact in supporting refugees. And I just asked myself, how long are we able to sustain that? And I think this is probably also maybe where the government becomes crucial then.
Yeah, so I definitely think governments have a role to play here. I think there are also things that can help make a lot of these things more sustainable. So the fact that you give refugees or displaced people immediate access to the labor market, meaning they have the right to work immediately. Children need to get immediate access to school. There needs to be immediate access to healthcare. Lots of these things that, the longer it takes for this access to happen, then you're actually relying more and more on NGOs, on civil society organizations, on others to give support where displaced people themselves are very happy to, let's say, make their own way, really contribute, do what needs to be done. They want to be active members of society. So what we can do to help them become active members of society as quickly and easily as possible will actually help with sustainability. Let them get on their feet as quickly as possible. Also put policies in place, put programs in place where they can get in touch with locals and have buddy programs, give language training immediately, make sure that people know that they're going to have a clear path to, for example, citizenship in the future. Let people just getting on with their lives. And this directly will lead to sustainability and will lead to less need for all of the additional assistance in the future.
All right, that already brings us to the last part, which is the outlook. And I was wondering also, because of all the things you just said that we see right now, do you think that the current situation has the potential to permanently change Europe's approach to dealing with refugees in general? Is there a reason for hope?
Okay, let's say there is always a reason for hope. And I do think with every quote unquote shock that happens, that there is some kind of learning done. I do think that this situation will fundamentally change to some extent the way we maybe deal with refugees in the future. I already see, and I don't even want to say, oh, well, at the EU level or at the national level, I already see it also at very local levels. So there are a lot of initiatives right now that have been sparked because of the Ukrainian situation, where local institutions are saying, hey, there's now this political will, the will also of the local population to do this. Let's go ahead and do this right now and extend it to all forced migrants. So basically, the current Ukrainian crisis has basically been the catalyst for being able to set up more programs, more infrastructure, more ways of doing things for others too. And it would be naive to think that this is going to be our last wave of refugees that we receive in Europe. And I think the fact that we're now putting into place proper structures to some extent with this situation will also hopefully benefit people in the future, or the next waves of refugees that we end up seeing here. So also the fact that the directive has been triggered and that we could see that Europe could work together, I think is a really good precedent for hopefully this being triggered again in the future when it's necessary. So yeah, I don't want to be overly optimistic and naive about the change that we're seeing, but I do think there is positive change there.
Okay. Well, Melissa, that brings us to the end of this episode already. It was a very interesting conversation, and hopefully we'll be able to welcome you back here on RPM Podcast in the future.
Of
Thank
course.
you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much.